Thank you so much, Akwaba. Good morning. Since we are celebrating birthdays, I wanted to mention that I had the privilege of opening NRGI's office in Ghana back in 2010. And next year, NRGI will be celebrating our 20th anniversary. And so we hope, thank you. I hope the cake is bigger. That was only 10, you know. But we hope that our partnership with ASEP continues not only for these past 10 years, but for many more years to come. And I'd like to take a moment to thank in particular Ben and also Charles for hosting us, and of course for the opportunity to come together as distinguished colleagues, leaders from around the world. I'd also like to take a special moment to recognize the participants from NRGI and ASEP's 2025 Summer School on the Governance of Extractive Industries. You are the next generation of leaders whose ideas and innovation will shape Africa's future. May I ask you to please stand if you are a summer school participant to be recognized. Thank you so much. Last month, the 4th Financing for Development Conference in Sevilla, Kenya helped to drive the launch of a bold new coalition joined by Benin, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and several other countries. Together, they committed to taxing premium air travel to raise new, additional, and predictable flows of public finance for sustainable development. If implemented globally, this measure alone could raise more than $80 billion in revenues, not loans, not aid, every year. Let me put this in perspective. The International Energy Agency estimates that achieving universal access to modern energy in Africa requires only $25 billion every year. So at first glance, this is just another tax, but it is actually far more significant. It represents the kind of financial innovation that African leaders can replicate, can scale up, and can channel to unlock energy access and economic transformations across Africa. Let me step back for a moment to explain why this kind of innovation is needed now more than ever before. 500 billion. 500 billion, along with related infrastructure spending, is the amount it will cost sub-Saharan Africa to close the energy poverty gap and to convert the energy system to a sustainable basis. 500 billion. That is a stunning figure. Let's contrast it with this. In 2023, financing for clean and renewable energy in all developing countries, not just sub-Saharan Africa, reached only $22 billion. Think about that. 500 billion needed for sub-Saharan Africa, and 22 billion available for all developing countries. Just a year ago, many still believed that bridging this massive finance gap might actually be achieved through blended finance. Blended finance is an idea that we use relatively small amounts of public finance to de-risk and leverage much larger flows of private investment. That was how the EU and the US managed to recover from the 2008 financial crisis. The promise of this billions to trillions narrative was that if African governments covered the risk and offered something like 9% yields on bonds intended to drive energy transition investments, then private investors would come flooding in, multiplying public money by 10, 100, even 1,000 times. But actual results show that the billions to trillions idea is an illusion. The Blended Finance Task Force found that rather than multiples of 10 or 100 or 1,000, the results are closer to 0.3. 0.3. That means that for every dollar of public money, only 30 cents of private finance are brought in. If you combine that reality with plummeting international development assistance levels and the constant chaos of tariff wars, one thing is clear. The rules of this game will not address Africa's needs to finance energy access and sustainable development. So, that leads us to the challenge that Ben put to us yesterday, and it's the right one. How do we innovate to meet the rightful expectations and aspirations for energy access of the next generation, those in this room, but also beyond? If, as the keynote speaker, you thought that I was going to have the answers, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. I'm actually counting on all of you for that. But building on NRGI's experience working with partners in government and civil society around the world, I want to share a few insights of what needs to change to enable that lasting and innovative financing solutions. First, successful financing starts with strategic, inclusive visions for just energy transitions. There is no single path for defining energy or economic transformations for the futures of countries. We need context-specific solutions aligned to the country's development ambitions and reflective of the voices and needs of different populations, as Shema mentioned. Here in Ghana, but also in Nigeria, NRGI has been working with partners to launch national dialogues to ensure that energy transition plans reflect public priorities. In Ghana's oil-producing regions, we've engaged with communities to amplify the concerns of fisherfolk, of women, and of youth. And in Senegal, we trained civil society partners to understand and ultimately engage with the public consultations around the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, and to raise concerns about energy access and equity that were not present. Building such strategic and inclusive visions ensures that the financing that is raised is directed towards the needs and the ambitions of people and their development plans. The second change that is needed is the color of money. Even promising initiatives, such as Senegal's JETP, risk pushing countries further into the debt trap. Of the financing pledged for the JETP, only 6.6% is in grants. More than 80% is structured as loans. Instead of creating fiscal space for investments in rural electrification or retraining workers, it risks adding pressure to unsustainable debt. Governments across Africa spend nearly 17% of their revenues on debt service. That's the highest of any developing region. And over half of Africans now live in countries that spend more on debt than on health or education. New lending models are needed to mobilize private capital, but these must offer African nations fairer interest rates that recognize what their growth trajectories are and avoid overburdening public budgets. And they absolutely must be paired with technical and technological support for renewables, addressing barriers like licensing and intellectual property. Finally, we must reinvigorate domestic resource mobilization. This is the primary engine of sustainable development financing. As Shema mentioned, Africa holds immense resources, including 30% of the world's transition mineral reserves. And African countries can leverage the global demand for minerals for strategic bargaining to move up the value chain, to diversify their economies, and to increase public revenues. Take Zambia, for example. They've attracted European support for a planned cobalt refinery and to facilitate investment in the electricity interconnector between Zambia and Tanzania. That will reduce the impact of increasing drought risks on their hydro capacity. Value addition like this, of course, isn't feasible in all countries and contexts, but such regional collaboration can overcome constraints, whether that's on scale, supply of inputs, or small downstream markets, and can then help unlock benefit from the mining sectors. In doing so, countries can move up the value chain and can increase domestic financing for just energy transitions and advance renewable technologies at home. So, strategic, inclusive, just transitions, changing the color of money, reinvigorating domestic resource mobilization. These are not small asks. They require long-term, sustained, and concerted focus. The influence of rich consumer countries still limits the scale of financing and compromises sovereignty over energy and resources. And rich countries must not be allowed to simply abdicate their roles and responsibilities. But there are opportunities to shift this global conversation today, or at least next week at the second Climate Week in Addis Ababa. The UN climate regime, for too long, has been silent on the issues of the minerals that are critical to delivering just transitions. The UN Secretary General himself said, "The race to net zero cannot trample over the poor." As a member of the UN panel on critical energy transition minerals, I and many others pushed for principles and actions for a new mining paradigm to guide the renewables revolution towards justice. At the second Climate Week in Addis next week, we have an opportunity to elevate the issue of minerals governance onto the UN climate agenda through the Just Transition Work Program. You can join us at the Africa Climate Summit and on the road to COP30 to issue a strong, united call for multilateral action and outcomes that center the needs and ambitions of Africans for improved transition mineral governance, just energy transitions, and finally, fair financing. The Sevilla Coalition showed that African leaders are already bringing practical, innovative ideas to the table. They must now be resolute in forging their own paths as the aid paradigm crumbles. By bringing the political will and the ambition to scale, replicate, and channel innovative sources of financing to energy transition priorities, we can ensure that those bold ideas lead to real progress and that real progress leads to economic and energy transformations for all Africans. Thank you.